who's in charge of the health of your kids? I mean, yeah, it should be us, right? The parents. Well, think again. The government's involved, and that's not a good thing. Emails recently obtained from the Freedom Foundation from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services show high-ranking officials at the CDC discussing the possibility of mandating COVID-19 vaccinations for school children. Now, the emails, which the agency attempted unsuccessfully to redact, were provided in response to a Freedom of Information request, a FOIA request, submitted as part of the Freedom Foundation's ongoing work to hold teacher unions accountable for their prominent role in COVID-19 school closures. And joining us now with more is Maxford Nelson with the Freedom Foundation. Maxford, great to have you on the show. Tell us more about this FOIA request that you clearly has new information. You have been trying to crack down on these teachers unions for a very long time.
Well, that's absolutely right, David, and thanks for having me on the program. We've been working for years now to hold teachers unions accountable, teachers unions like the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, for the role that they played in initiating and then prolonging closures of public schools around the country during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we found in the latest batch of emails to come out of the Department of Health and Human Services is pretty shocking. And it shows the highest ranking officials at the CDC, this director of the Office of Policy, essentially wishing for the National Education Association to come on board with the concept of mandatory vaccines requirements for students in order to attend public school. And the context for the email that we received, this was an email sent in August of 2021, is a press release that the NEA, the biggest teachers union in the country, had put out right before the start of the 2021-2022 academic year, in which the union, the NEA, endorsed mandatory vaccine or mandatory testing requirements for educators and those working in public schools. And of course, that set off a chain reaction almost immediately in blue state legislatures and governor's offices and in the major urban school districts around the country to do exactly that and mandate COVID vaccines for employees in the public school system. Well, of course, that was received very well by the CDC. But as this email with the press release got forwarded around the agency, it eventually made its way to the CDC's director for the Office of Policy. And she responded to her colleague that forwarded it to her and essentially said, great, but I wish the NEA would come on board with this concept for students as well. This is some pretty crazy stuff. I think this would have been even more damaging to students. It would have made reopening even more difficult. It would have been immensely controversial. Mm-hmm. And even to this day, the only school system in the country to require COVID vaccines for students is the District of Columbia. And that's only as of this year. So there's some other twists to the story, but it's pretty crazy. Yeah.
In your best guess, I mean, let's talk turkey here for just a minute, because a lot of times we don't tie together the real motive here. What is the real motive, as to your best guess, as to why these unions are so adamant about jabbing and masking children who are clearly not in danger from COVID, right? Mm-hmm. And even if they were, we know that masks don't work. I'm not sure we've ever had situations where such mandates are imposed on people with zero scientific evidence, but that's what we're talking about doing here. Zero scientific evidence for jabs or masks helping children in any way, shape, or form regarding COVID or really anything else, and potential harm, a lot of potential harm, in fact. So what is the real motive of these teachers unions? Is there a financial motive behind the scenes? Is this just really all about compliance and a communist agenda? I mean, what's your best guess here as to what's really happening?
Well, I think there's a couple different factors at work, and it's a great question. On the one hand, unions, public sector unions like the NEA, are just by their nature going to be more aligned with government. They are fans of big government. They want government to grow and expand. They view government bureaucrats as the proper source of power for who should be running the country. So I think naturally they're going to be more aligned with a big government, top-down, control your life by the technocrats agenda. But there are financial incentives as well. And you can see this by looking at the behavior of the unions during the pandemic. Essentially, they treated the pandemic as a strike that the unions themselves didn't have to initiate. Teachers were out of the classroom for public health reasons, And that gave them the opportunity to set the terms upon which they would return to the classroom. And it gave them the opportunity to extract concessions that they sought for a long time from school boards, from state lawmakers, from federal lawmakers. And so depending on the jurisdiction, we saw the policy demands from the teachers unions in places like LA or Chicago that had nothing to do with public education. Progressive wish list items like defunding the police or overhauling the tax code, things, again, that had little to no bearing on the classroom, but they were part of the progressive movement's wish list. And of course, the teachers unions are a core constituency there on the left. But then I think the third component is just directly financial. And you saw the unions going to federal policymakers and saying, oh, we need all this new money to flood into public schools. We need all these new safety mechanisms, and we need to overhaul the HVAC systems. And so we need all this new taxpayer dollars to get us through the pandemic. Well, the money came, but then what you've seen in the years since is most of that money did not go towards COVID mitigation or offsetting learning loss that students have experienced due to these prolonged and unnecessary school closures. Most of that money is going into either new staff, more teachers, more union members paying dues, and increased salaries, wages, and benefits for school employees.
Boom. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the financial aspect, Maxford, because as you have a report there on your website, the Freedom Foundation website, about $36 million that labor unions are receiving from the COVID relief money, including many teachers unions. And so this really feels very much about not just money, but how that money gets spent and the coordination between government and the unions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there was a research report that we put out last year that you mentioned that looked specifically at the Paycheck Protection Program. And we've heard so much about fraud in these federal COVID relief programs over the last few years, and you're going to keep hearing more. But one component to that we looked at specifically was labor unions like teachers unions that were not eligible in the first year of the program's life for these federally administered Paycheck Protection Program loans that were essentially grants, forgivable loans. But during that first year of the program, we identified more than 200 unions that received, as you mentioned, upwards of $30 million that they just were not legally eligible for. No question about it. But they were applying for it, receiving the funds, and no controls were in place to stop it.
Yeah, Maxford Nelson, great to have you here. Thanks for all the important work you're doing to help kids all around this country.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Maxford.
it. Thanks so much.